On a frozen night in a quiet town, a man walks out of a diner with nothing but a cheap meal for his daughter until he sees them. 6 women in torn military uniforms standing silent in the snow, like ghosts no one wanted back. Most people would have turned away. He opened his door. What followed shattered everything he thought he knew about war loyalty and what it means to do the right thing when no one's watching. Are you watching this at night? Or maybe from somewhere far away? Wherever you are, tell us, where are you listening from? On a Thursday evening in early December, the streets of Everpine, an aging town tucked into northern Minnesota, were already blanketed in snow by the time Andrew Calloway clocked out. He was a man of quiet rhythms, someone whose days had long lost any sharp edges. Around 50, Andrew had the kind of face that never startled anyone, lined but not harsh like weathered wood. His flannel shirt was buttoned up tight beneath a faded work jacket, and his hands, rough from years of maintenance work at the local elementary school, were tucked deep into his coat pockets. The wind had picked up that day, not violent but persistent, the kind that reminded people up north how long the winter could be. The temperature had sunk well below freezing before sunset, and now the sidewalks glistened under the weak yellow glow of street lamps. It was the kind of night when people hurried indoors and stayed there. He didn't drive far, just a few blocks down Main Street, before pulling into the cracked lot outside Lisa's diner. He came here often not to sit and eat, like he once did when life was fuller, but to pick up a discounted meal for his daughter Clara. She was 9 and didn't mind if her dinner came reheated as long as it was warm and tasted like it had once been made with care. The diner was near empty, the way it always was this time of night. One waitress, no music, just the humming of fluorescent lights and the dull rattle of wind against the windows. Andrew stepped inside, nodded at the young woman behind the counter, Tanya, maybe 22, and gestured toward the back where the kitchen prepped its unsold trays for take-home. "You just missed the last of the shepherd's pie," Tanya said, as she boxed up what looked like meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and a slice of cornbread. "This one's still warm if you eat it soon. Don't let it sit too long. Microwave will dry it out." Andrew gave a faint smile, took the box, and passed her a 10. "She likes the cornbread," he said. That was all. He didn't stay to chat. Outside, the wind hit harder. He kept his head down, boots crunching over packed snow as he walked toward his truck, the box of food held steady in both hands. That was when he saw them. Near the back corner of the diner, just outside the light's reach, stood 6 figures. Women. They were grouped loosely, like they hadn't decided if they were a team or just happened to be there together. Their clothes were military-issue old fatigues layered with jackets that looked worn past regulation. A couple wore beanies or hoods pulled tight. None of them spoke. They weren't panhandling, not exactly. They were just there like people who'd run out of places to be. One of them, tall, with a firm jaw and sharp eyes, stepped forward slightly. Her voice was low but steady. "Sir," she said, "if you're not going to eat that, it might get us through the night." Andrew stopped, not because of her words exactly, but because of how she said them. There was no pleading in her tone, no desperation. It was practical, almost practiced, like someone who'd learned to ask without begging. From behind him, the diner door creaked open again. Tanya had stepped outside to toss a trash bag into the dumpster. She glanced at the women, then looked to Andrew. Her voice dropped as she passed by. "You might want to be careful," she said under her breath. "They don't really look like the usual folks." Andrew didn't respond. He stood there, breath visible, heart slower than it should have been. The women didn't move. The tall one just held his gaze, waiting, not pressuring. Her posture was straight, her dignity intact. His fingers tightened around the styrofoam container. He looked down at the box, then up at her again. "I'm Andrew," he said simply. "I've got a place a few blocks from here. It's warm, and there's a sofa nobody's using." He paused, then added, "And I have more food at home than I usually admit." For a second, no one moved. Then the tall woman nodded once, subtle, not grateful, just acknowledging. "I'm Dahlia," she said. "We don't mean trouble." "I didn't think you did," Andrew replied. He unlocked his truck, stepped aside, and gestured toward the back. "Hop in. It's too damn cold to argue about manners." The ride was silent, but not tense. Dahlia sat up front beside him, the other 5 in the back seat of his aging crew cab. They smelled faintly of smoke, sweat, and wet fabric, but not neglect. More like people who'd been moving too long without rest. Andrew didn't ask questions, didn't need to. He could feel the weight of whatever they carried, the kind of silence that fills in for what people stop saying. His house was small, a two-bedroom, one-bath structure on a dead-end street with bare trees stretching over the roof like skeletal arms. He pulled into the drive, killed the engine, and motioned them in. Clara was already asleep, her school backpack on the floor beside the couch, a half-finished drawing on the coffee table. The living room was warm, lived in, cluttered in a manageable way. Pictures of his wife still hung on the walls, their frames dusted regularly, but never touched. He set the food on the kitchen counter, flipped the switch on the electric kettle, and turned to the group. "I don't know what you need," he said, "but whatever I've got, it's yours for now." Dahlia's eyes swept the room, not judgmental, just alert. She nodded to the others. They stepped inside without a word. One of them, smaller, with dark curls and tired eyes, paused beside Clara's drawing. She touched the corner of the paper gently before moving on. Andrew made tea. They didn't speak much that night. He offered blankets, pointed out where the bathroom was, and set a pot of soup to warm on the stove. The women settled quietly into the corners of the room floor armchairs, a faded love seat by the fireplace. They didn't demand or apologize, just existed, present but unobtrusive. By midnight, he sat in his recliner, eyes half-lidded, watching the fire crackle in the hearth. Dahlia sat nearby, legs stretched out, arms folded across her chest. She hadn't taken off her boots. "You don't know who we are," she said quietly. Andrew stared into the fire. "No," he answered, "but I know what kind of night it is, and what kind of country this sometimes is too." She didn't smile, but her shoulders eased just slightly. Then she turned her gaze to the flames and said nothing more. And in the silence that followed, Andrew thought about how quiet can sometimes carry more truth than words. Thought about how something in his chest had stirred. Not pity, not curiosity, but recognition. These women hadn't asked for charity. They had asked to not be erased. And he had answered, not because he was noble or brave, but because somewhere in him, the part still intact after losing his wife, after learning to raise a child alone, after burying his certainty in the ground with her, still believed that dignity deserved shelter, and that on a night this cold was enough. Under the pale light of early morning, the living room looked different. The shadows had softened, the chill in the air pushed back by the steady hum of the old radiator and the warm drift of sunlight sneaking through threadbare curtains. Andrew stood at the edge of the kitchen, a mug of lukewarm coffee in hand, watching as the 6 women, who just 12 hours earlier were strangers at the back of a diner, sat scattered around his home, like fragments of a story not yet told. Some on the couch, others on the floor wrapped in borrowed blankets and half asleep, but alert in the way people become when rest is unfamiliar. His daughter Clara stood in the doorway with her arms folded around a large pad of drawing paper. Her hair was a bit wild from sleep, and her socks didn't match, but her eyes were sharp, full of curiosity and not a hint of fear. She stared at them for a moment, then turned to Andrew and whispered just loud enough to carry across the room, "Dad, are they soldiers?" Andrew nodded without looking away. "They were," he said softly, then corrected himself. "They still are." Clara, sensing permission, stepped further into the room. She walked slowly, not hesitantly, but like someone approaching animals in the woods, careful not to startle. She held her sketchpad in front of her like a peace offering. "I draw people sometimes," she said, "to no one in particular. Would it be okay if I drew you?" There was a pause. Then one woman, the same tall, steady one from last night, Dahlia, lifted her chin and said, "You can try, but you'll have to work fast. My face changes depending on the lighting." It broke the stillness just enough that a few of the others chuckled. Clara smiled and sat down cross-legged on the rug. She began to draw. The pencil moved lightly, carefully. "Can I know your names?" she asked, eyes darting up from the page. The women exchanged glances, some reluctant, others resigned, but something about the girl's sincerity made refusal feel unnecessary. "Dahlia," the tall one said again, her voice even. Carmen came a soft voice from the corner of the couch. The woman who spoke was small, her shoulders hunched, a wool hat pulled low. Her hands were clasped around a photo, though the image itself remained hidden. "Juno," said another, seated on a dining chair pulled near the heater. She had short black hair and a face that seemed always halfway between amusement and calculation. Greta murmured, a woman who was wrapping a bandage, unused but clean, around her own wrist, like a habit she couldn't drop. Devin said the one reclining on the floor, their voice lower than expected. They didn't move much, just glanced up, made eye contact with Clara, and nodded once. Tasha came the last. She was sitting near the window, barely moving, her back straight, gaze focused beyond the glass, as if she were watching something only she could see. Clara's pencil kept moving. She didn't ask why they were there. She didn't ask what had happened. Instead, she said, "You all look like you've been lots of places." Juno responded first, a small smirk lifting one corner of her mouth. "We have. Some of them on purpose." Andrew leaned back against the kitchen counter, sipping his coffee more out of habit than thirst. He didn't interrupt. He wanted to know too, but he knew better than to push. People talk when they're ready, and these women had the look of people who hadn't been listened to in a long time. It was Carmen who broke the unspoken wall. Her voice barely above a whisper, she looked at Clara and said, "I used to fix broken bones. In the field. Fast and quiet, no time to ask names." She paused, then tapped the photo in her lap. "Came home to bury my daughter. Didn't get the same kind of help I gave." Clara didn't flinch. She simply said, "That's sad," and kept drawing. Juno picked up from there, her tone a little sharper. "I shut down a signal transmission in a conflict zone. Orders said, green light, I saw civilians on the feed. I pulled the plug. Saved a lot of people. Got a demotion for disrupting chain of command." Greta was quieter, slower to speak. "I was a field medic, too. I saw a child with a shrapnel wound, maybe 7, looked like she could be Clara's age. I hesitated just long enough to hold her hand. That's when they said I wasn't fit to make operational judgments. Pulled me out, reassigned me to inventory until I resigned." Dahlia didn't need to explain. She simply looked up and said, "I gave a counter order to protect unarmed villagers. Got branded as insubordinate, court-martialed without ceremony." Her voice didn't carry bitterness, just fact. Devin finally sat up a bit, stretching their arms before speaking. "Drone operator. One blast went wrong, took out a tent I was working near. I blacked out. 2 weeks gone, memory fogged. When I came back, my clearance was revoked. They didn't say it, but I think they were afraid I'd seen something they didn't want remembered." Tasha didn't speak right away. Clara looked at her, waiting. Then the woman said, "I filed a complaint. Saw kickback supplies being rerouted, names changed. Wrote a report. Next day, I was reassigned to an unnamed outpost. 10 months later, discharged for failure to reintegrate." She still didn't blink. There was no crying, no dramatic pauses, just statements, delivered plainly, but with weight. These weren't stories, they were receipts, tallied moments of decency punished like crimes. Andrew set his mug down and cleared his throat. "You don't have to share more," he said. "Not here, not now." But Dahlia shook her head. Sometimes saying it out loud is the only way to stop it from echoing. Clara turned her drawing around to show them. "You all look strong," she said. Greta, blinking more than usual, leaned forward. "What do you call this masterpiece?" Clara thought for a second. "The Winter Six," she said, "because it's cold outside, but you're still here." A small sound came from Devin, a laugh, short and real. Dahlia nodded slowly. "That's a name I can live with." Andrew took a slow breath and glanced at each of them again. Women from different walks, different skin tones, different pasts, but all carrying the same kind of silence, the same resignation that came from being erased by a system that had once praised them only to discard them when their humanity got in the way. He wasn't sure what would happen next. He wasn't sure how long they would stay, or what would be asked of him, or whether the decision to let them in would make things harder before it made them better. But watching Clara hand her drawing to Carmen, who held it like it might fall apart if she'd let go, he realized something had already changed. This wasn't about shelter anymore. It was about something bigger. These 6 women had once served a country that didn't want to remember them. And now, in this house on this snowy street, someone had finally given them names again. And that mattered. Morning came slowly, as it always did in December. Pale light slipped in through the kitchen window, casting a thin silver hue across the counter, where a half-used roll of paper towels leaned against a coffee mug, still holding yesterday's grounds. The old furnace rattled in the basement, kicking on with a reluctant groan that echoed softly through the floorboards. Andrew stood in the hallway between the kitchen and living room, watching the women stir from sleep, or more accurately, from restlessness. He could tell none of them had truly slept. They had simply stopped moving for a while. Clara was already awake. She moved quietly the way children do when they're unsure whether to act like guests or hosts. She had pulled on a navy blue sweater 2 sizes too big. Sleeves swallowed her wrists. With her sketchbook pressed to her chest and hair only half brushed, she peered around the corner into the living room, where the 6 women were gathered in loose formation, some sitting on the floor, one at the dining table, another at the far window. The room was warmer now, but the air still carried that cautious silence, the kind that settles where people don't yet know if they belong. The first sound came from the kitchen, the click and spring pop of the toaster ejecting 2 slices of bread. Devon, standing motionless in front of it, didn't react at first. Her gaze was locked on the red coils inside, like she was waiting for something else. When the toast finally popped, she blinked, took a step back, and let out a breath she'd clearly been holding. Clara watched from behind the fridge door. "Did it scare you?" Clara asked, voice low. Devon glanced over, eyes a little too wide for morning. She hesitated, then offered a small nod. "It reminded me of something. Not the sound exactly, just the waiting." Clara didn't say anything for a moment. Then she reached for a plate from the lower cabinet and handed it to Devon. "Toast is better with peanut butter," she said plainly. Devon accepted it with both hands, the edges of her lips curling not quite into a smile, but close enough. On the other side of the room, Carmen sat curled on the end of the sofa with a blanket around her shoulders, her thumb brushing rhythmically across the corner of a small photograph. She didn't look at anyone. Her eyes had that far-off focus of someone not entirely in the room, like she was listening to a memory louder than the present. Greta walked past her with a glass of water, paused, and gently placed her hand on Carmen's shoulder. Carmen didn't flinch, didn't look up, but her hand stopped trembling. That was enough. By the front door, Juno moved between the deadbolt and the knob, checking each lock with careful, repeated clicks. Once, then again, then a third time. She didn't seem anxious, exactly more like her body was moving through a ritual it refused to unlearn. Andrew noticed from the hallway, but didn't interrupt. Instead, he reached for a screwdriver from the junk drawer and quietly tightened the screws on the door frame after she stepped away. Tasha hadn't spoken yet. She stood in the far corner near the living room window, arms crossed, body still. She faced the backyard like a sentinel, as if watching for a danger no one else could see. Clara wandered over to her with a piece of toast in her hand. "Are you guarding us?" Clara asked. Tasha didn't turn her head, just replied evenly, "No, just watching. That way I know we're still here." Clara thought about that for a moment. Does watching help? Tasha's jaw moved, slightly a slow consideration. "Sometimes. It tells me if anything's changed." Breakfast was quiet. The only voices came from the radio on the counter, set to low volume, just enough to fill the silence with static and morning headlines. The women didn't talk much, but they didn't avoid each other either. Their movements were deliberate, soft-footed, as if unwilling to disturb whatever fragile balance had been achieved overnight. Clara returned to her drawings, now scattered across the coffee table, each page labeled with a name. She took a pencil and wrote a new one, carefully printing Tasha under a half-sketched outline of a woman by a window. Greta sat beside her and traced a fingertip across the edge of her own name. "No one's written my name in a long time," Greta said quietly. Clara looked up. "That's not okay." Greta smiled, small and sad. "No, it's not. But it matters that you did." Andrew moved through the house with a kind of second-hand tension, absorbing everything without pressing into it. He wasn't someone who needed explanations to recognize pain. He simply responded to what was in front of him, fixing a loose cabinet hinge, tightening the leg of a wobbling chair, handing Juno a hot mug without asking if she wanted one. Little things. Acts of presence. Later that morning, Clara sat beside Dahlia, near the fireplace sketchbook balanced on her lap. Dahlia stared into the flames, arms resting loosely on her knees. Her posture was controlled, but not rigid, like someone used to holding still under pressure. "Were you ever scared?" Clara asked. Dahlia didn't answer right away. The fire cracked, sending up a small pop that made Devon twitch slightly from across the room. Dahlia glanced at her, then looked back at Clara. "Yes, plenty of times." "But you're a soldier," Clara said. "Soldiers aren't supposed to be scared." Dahlia leaned forward a little. "That's a lie people tell so they can feel safe around us. The truth is, we get scared. We just don't always have time to show it." Clara absorbed that, then nodded like she understood. In the quiet that followed, Andrew felt something shift. Not a big change, but the kind you feel in your chest, like air slowly warming after a long freeze. The women were still guarded, still half holding their breath, but the house had started to feel like a place rather than a pause. The lines between guest and resident had begun to blur, and with them, the walls between silence and speech, memory and presence, pain and recognition. And when Clara taped each of their names above the kitchen table, later that day, using mismatched paper and her best handwriting, none of the women took them down. The sun held back for most of the morning, shy behind thick clouds that only let in a dull silver light, but it was enough to soften the corners of the house. Inside, warmth came not just from the radiator or the old fireplace, but from the sound of people moving without hesitation. By now, the presence of the 6 women no longer felt like an intrusion. Their routines began to stitch into the fabric of the house, not loudly or deliberately, but in small, necessary ways, as if they belonged without asking permission. Greta stood at the stove beside Andrew, ladling batter onto a pan to make pancakes that were slightly uneven but smelled comforting. Her sleeves were rolled up, and her movements were practiced but not rushed, as though she had done this before in another life. Andrew handed her the spatula without a word, and she nodded with something that resembled peace. Dahlia crouched beside the hallway vent, using a flashlight and a small screwdriver to adjust the intake. The sound of her working was steady, the kind that suggested focus and purpose, and it filled the space with a low, calming rhythm. When Andrew walked past her with a box of tools, she looked up and said, "Your filter was jammed. Might want to get a new one before it starts blowing cold air." He gave a small nod. "I'll pick one up this week." Dahlia returned to her task without further comment, but the corner of her mouth twitched just slightly. Out back, Tasha was patching the broken pane in the mudroom door with a sheet of clear polycarbonate Andrew had forgotten he even had in the shed. Her hands were careful, her grip firm, and when Juno passed by with a roll of duct tape and a screwdriver, she simply handed them off like they had done this exact job together many times before. There were no instructions exchanged, just silent cooperation. Inside, Devin knelt behind the router checking cables and untangling wires like muscle memory had kicked in. Her brows furrowed slightly as she traced the path of the Ethernet cord, her fingertips brushing the worn floor as she reached behind the bookshelf to adjust the surge protector. She didn't speak, but the look on her face was one of relief. Something in the circuitry still made sense. Clara, watching all of this, didn't say much at first. She stood at the doorway between the kitchen and living room, one hand clutching her sketchbook, the other wrapped around a cup of hot cocoa that Greta had made just for her. Eventually, she wandered into the room where Devin was working and sat cross-legged on the rug. "You fixed the Wi-Fi," Clara said, mostly as observation. Devin turned to look at her, brushing dust from her hands. "Sort of. It was mostly just unplugged." Clara nodded solemnly. "Still, I think it's brave to touch wires. They look like nerves." Devin chuckled a sound that came from deep in her throat and surprised them both. "That's not far off, actually." Later, Clara joined Greta at the dining table. The older woman had pulled out a small notebook from her pack, its cover frayed and soft at the edges. She offered Clara a blank page, and together they began making a list. Greta titled it in block letters, "Things Worth Staying For." Clara, after thinking hard, wrote down "cocoa that's just the right temperature," then added "nobody asking for your papers," and finally in smaller letters, "the quiet kind of hugs." Greta looked at the last one for a long time before writing, "the sound of toast in the morning when you're not scared." They didn't speak while they wrote. They didn't need to. In the living room, Dahlia helped Andrew replace the batteries in the smoke detector, and when the high-pitched test beep rang out unexpectedly, Juno flinched from the other side of the house, instinctively ducking slightly before composing herself. Dahlia called out, "All clear, just a test," her voice calm and loud enough to carry. Juno exhaled through her nose and resumed adjusting the light fixture above the stairwell, still slightly breathless but not unsteady. Andrew stood at the bottom step and said, "You okay?" She nodded without looking down. "Just didn't like that sound. Reminded me of the base alarms." "You don't forget those." When lunchtime came around, nobody asked who was cooking. Carmen had already started peeling carrots. Greta was slicing bread. Dahlia was chopping onions with the kind of precision that made Andrew wonder what else she'd been trained to handle. The kitchen filled with the quiet music of shared space dishes, clinking water, running soft footsteps, moving from stove to counter. Clara sat on the floor with Maya, a neighborhood girl who had wandered over with a bag of old toys and stayed for soup. They were coloring quietly. Maya asked Clara, "Who are they?" Clara didn't pause. "They're my winter people." That night, after everyone had eaten and the dishes were drying in mismatched stacks, Clara found Devin in the hallway, standing near the coat rack holding her own coat, like she wasn't sure whether to put it on. Clara stepped up and asked, "Are you leaving?" Devin looked down a little startled. "No, not yet." Clara tilted her head. "Then why are you holding it?" Devin paused, then laughed gently. "Habit, I guess. I don't stay in places very long." Clara took a deep breath and said, "But you can stay here. No one will ask you to prove anything." Devin crouched to her level and said quietly, "Why do you trust me?" Clara's answer came without hesitation. "Because my dad sleeps through the night now." Devin blinked, then smiled. "That's a pretty good reason." Greta tucked Clara into bed later, adjusting the blanket with the kind of care that came from someone who'd long been denied the chance to nurture. Clara, half asleep, mumbled, "I don't want them to leave." Greta sat on the edge of the bed, brushing a curl off Clara's forehead. "I know. Sometimes people leave, even when they don't want to. But we'll stay as long as we can." Clara opened one eye. "Promise." Greta hesitated, then said, "Promise for now." Downstairs, Andrew sat by the fire staring at the fading embers. Dahlia sat across from him, arms folded, one leg crossed over the other. She wasn't trying to read his expression, just sharing the quiet. "They're helping," Andrew said finally. Dahlia nodded. "It's easier to move when you feel useful." He looked over. "Do you think they'll stay?" Dahlia answered after a moment. "I think for the first time in a long time they want to." Andrew nodded slowly, the weight in his chest a little lighter. And for the first night since the women arrived, no one checked the locks more than once. The snowfall returned by mid-afternoon, fine and quiet, settling into the corners of windows and softening the view outside, like someone had smudged the edges of the world. Inside, the mood had shifted. It wasn't the slow warmth of the morning or the domestic calm of patching walls and mending fences. This was something else, a quiet hum of unfinished business beginning to stir. Naomi had spent most of the afternoon hunched over her laptop at the dining table, her fingers moving across the keys, like they remembered something her mind hadn't fully caught up to. Her eyes were sharp behind a pair of reading glasses borrowed from Andrew, and a tension had gathered in her shoulders that hadn't been there during breakfast. Dahlia noticed it first, the way Naomi leaned in closer with each line of code she pulled up. Eventually, she walked over and asked, "You find something Naomi didn't look up?" "I think so. It's old, real old. Backup signal files from Echo Dust. Someone tried to bury it under a dummy folder, but it's still here." The name Echo Dust brought a hush to the room. Devin looked up from the couch. Juno paused with a wrench halfway to tightening a loose door hinge. Even Tasha turned from the window. Dahlia's jaw clenched. "Play it." Naomi clicked through the folders with deliberate care, like she was touching something sacred. Then the audio came through, grainy, staticky, but clear enough. A woman's voice, firm but composed, came across the small speakers. "This is Sergeant Brooks. Local population is still evacuating. I'm delaying our withdrawal until the last civilian is clear." Then silence. Then static. Then another voice, curt male, agitated. "Repeat, Sergeant. You are not authorized to delay. This is a direct order." Dahlia's voice, again calm as before. "Acknowledged, sir. Civilian life takes priority. Over." The clip ended. Naomi leaned back in her chair. "That's it. That's the moment. They charged you with insubordination for saving people." Dahlia didn't speak. She stared at the laptop like it had just confessed a lie she always suspected. Juno leaned in. "This proves she followed protocol. Field command allows for judgment calls in civilian emergencies." Naomi nodded. They ignored that part. Deliberately. Tasha was already pulling her phone from her jacket. "I know someone. Still works in records. Not official anymore, but he knows where things get buried." She stepped into the hallway to make the call, and for a moment, the rest sat in stunned quiet. By evening, Tasha returned with a flash drive. She didn't say much, just handed it to Naomi, who plugged it in without ceremony. What loaded next was even heavier than the audio file. Personnel evaluations, 6 profiles, all of them familiar. Dahlia, Carmen, Juno, Greta, Devin, Tasha. Each one displayed with timelines, commendations, then crossed out entries. Notes overwritten, words replaced. Dahlia's original record, exemplary leadership under stress. Updated to tendency toward aggressive behavior, disregards command. Carmen's file once praised her as a compassionate and focused medic, now marked emotionally unstable, inappropriate for redeployment. Juno, technically gifted and precise under pressure, replaced with interferes with command flow, unpredictable. Devin, exceptional drone control, quick decision maker, overwritten by potential memory disruption, compromised reliability. Greta's file had been marked empathetic and skilled under duress. Now read simply, disengaged, emotionally compromised. Tasha's line item for whistleblowing, which had once earned her a commendation, now read, failure to integrate, resisted reassignment. Andrew stood behind them, arms folded, face unreadable. He had no military background, but he knew what rewritten history looked like. Dahlia clicked through each screen slowly. Her fingers hovered over the mouse like she didn't want to let go. "They didn't just erase us," she said, her voice low. "They rewrote us into something no one would question losing." Greta sat down at the table, hard hands in her lap, her shoulders curled forward, like the weight of those words had landed fully on her back. They didn't even lie well, just enough that no one would check. Naomi kept scrolling. "There are logs. Edits, all made within the same 48-hour window. Same access key." Tasha looked over. "Someone up the chain wanted us gone. Not because we failed, but because we didn't fall in line." Juno shook her head. "This wasn't about discipline. It was about narrative. They couldn't have us be the story." Carmen whispered, "And no one asked why we disappeared. They just accepted the silence." For a while, no one said anything. The only sound was the tick of the wall clock and the occasional creak of the floorboards as the house settled in the cold. Then Andrew stepped forward and placed a steady hand on Dahlia's shoulder. "Well, I think it's time we made some noise." Dahlia looked up at him, eyes tired but alert. "You sure about that?" He nodded. "I'm sure they count on most people keeping quiet. But not everyone does." Later that night, they printed the files. Each woman held her own record, reading the sentences that had stolen years from them, taken jobs, broken trust. Clara came downstairs in pajamas and saw them all sitting in the dining room, lit only by a desk lamp and the glow of the laptop screen. She didn't say anything right away. She walked over to Dahlia, who quickly folded the printout in half. Clara asked, "Are they trying to say you're bad?" Dahlia hesitated. "They're trying to say we're not who we are." Clara looked confused. "But I know who you are." Dahlia smiled for the first time that evening. That's what matters most. That night, nobody slept easily, but they all stayed. And for the first time, they knew they were staying, not just because they needed shelter, but because the truth had a shape again, clear, hard, undeniable. They had proof now. They had names and dates and voices on record. And whether the world wanted to hear it or not, they were ready to speak. The snowfall had stopped by late morning, and the clouds had begun to part, but there was something colder in the air than weather. It came with a knock. Not hurried, not aggressive, just deliberate, like someone who expected to be let in. Andrew wiped his hands on a dish towel and opened the door to find a woman standing neatly in a slate gray coat, holding a leather-bound folder and wearing the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. She introduced herself smoothly. "Judith Saunders, Family Services, Pine County. I'm here on follow-up for a report received yesterday morning." Anonymous, of course. Andrew stepped aside out of reflex. He'd been raised to be polite to authority, and Judith had the calm, practiced tone of someone who knew how to be listened to without ever raising her voice. Her eyes moved as she stepped in one glance, sweeping across the living room, then the dining table, then the coat hooks by the stairs. Dahlia was sitting on the arm of the couch reading. Greta had just come in from the back porch with wood for the fireplace. Clara was upstairs working on her drawings. Judith removed her gloves methodically and opened her folder. "We were told a minor lives here with unrelated adults. That raises certain procedural flags, Mr. Calloway. I'm not here to accuse anyone of wrongdoing, just gathering facts." Andrew nodded, keeping his tone even. "We have nothing to hide. Clara is my daughter. The women here are guests, veterans." Judith gave a small, acknowledging smile, flipping through her forms. "Yes, I gathered as much. Dahlia Brooks, correct." She turned eyes, finding Dahlia, who didn't stand but held Judith's gaze calmly. "You served under Echo Dust." It wasn't a question. Dahlia's jaw tensed slightly. "I did." Judith nodded, making a note. "You were formally discharged for disciplinary reasons, is that right?" Dahlia didn't blink. "I was discharged for saving civilians when I was ordered not to." Judith wrote something else. "Of course. I'm sure it's more complex than the paperwork suggests." She turned next to Devin, who had just stepped into the room, wiping her hands on her jeans after fixing a loose panel upstairs. Judith's tone remained pleasant. "And you, Devin Lewis, technical specialist. There was a report of neurological symptoms following a blast incident." Devin hesitated, measuring her breath. "I had temporary memory loss. I've recovered." Judith nodded. "That must have been difficult. And now you're residing here." Devin looked toward Andrew, then back. "I'm helping where I can." Greta had stopped mid-motion at the kitchen doorway, dish towel in hand. Judith gave her a brief glance, her tone shifting. "And you were a medic, correct? From your records, no formal charges. Just a note about emotional instability during active duty." Greta's voice was quiet. I saw a lot of things that deserved emotion. That's not the same as instability. Judith let the silence sit before turning pages. Her next question was directed to Tasha, who stood near the fireplace. And you're of First Nations descent. I imagine the transition back from service was different for you. Tasha's tone was flat. No more than for anyone else who did the right thing and got punished for it. Judith offered a small, polite smile again, writing quickly. Andrew stepped forward slightly. Is this all necessary? You've met them. You've seen the house. Clara is safe. Isn't that enough? Judith didn't look up. I'm sure you believe that, but the system has protocols. It's not about belief. Her voice was still even, but it pressed against the air like a glove around a throat. Just then, Clara appeared at the top of the stairs, holding a piece of paper. She walked down slowly, sensing something was wrong in the room. Judith turned toward her with the carefully measured tone adults use when speaking to children they don't quite trust. Hello, Clara. I'm just making sure everything's all right here. Do you feel safe? Clara looked at her, then at the women in the room. They're my friends. Judith smiled. And how long have they been staying with you? Clara shrugged. I don't know. Time goes fast when people are nice. Judith chuckled softly. I see. And what do they do all day? Clara frowned slightly. Devin fixed the computer. Dahlia helped Dad with the vent. Greta makes pancakes. Juno checks the locks. Tasha fixed the roof. Carmen helped me write a letter. Judith's pen paused. And do you ever feel uncomfortable or confused by what's going on? Clara's brow furrowed. Why would I be? Judith glanced at Andrew. Children often absorb more than we realize. We have to be cautious. Clara's voice sharpened just a bit. My dad sleeps better now. He smiles more. That didn't happen before they came. So if this is about who's good and who's not, they're the good ones. Judith's face remained composed, but her hand closed the folder with a soft but final thud. She stood. Thank you for your time. I'll file this as a preliminary report. It's possible we'll revisit depending on additional findings. She extended her hand to Andrew. He shook it, but his grip was firmer now. We have nothing to hide, he said again slower. Judith gave one last glance at the room. Of course. Still, one never knows who people really are until something happens. Let's hope nothing does. And with that, she left. The room remained still for a long moment after the door closed. Carmen let out a breath. Dahlia stood and walked to the window, watching the car pull away. Devin sank onto the arm of the chair, rubbing her hands together. That woman could smile while cutting your legs off. Juno nodded slowly. She didn't say anything wrong, but she said it all. Andrew turned to Clara, kneeling beside her. You okay, kiddo? Clara nodded, but her eyes were wet. I didn't like her voice. She looked at them like they were broken. Andrew looked over at the women, each of whom was quietly collecting themselves. They're not broken. They're just tired of proving they're not. That night, the women stayed closer together. Nobody said much. Nobody needed to. But Clara asked to sleep on the couch downstairs. And Dahlia, without speaking, brought her a blanket and stayed awake long after the others had gone to bed, just in case someone knocked again. The air outside carried the first signs of spring, though winter still held a quiet grip on the edges of the town. Snowbanks shrank just enough to reveal the gravel underneath, and the roof lines began to drip like a clock ticking slowly forward. Inside the house, something else was thawing. The silence that had wrapped itself around the women, the silence they had worn like a second skin, was beginning to fray. It didn't come apart with shouting or declarations, but in the slow decision to stop hiding. Naomi sat at the dining table with her laptop open and a mug of black coffee turning cold beside her. The others were scattered around the room, not far, but giving her space. On the screen was the audio file, the same one they had all listened to the week before. Dahlia's voice, steady under pressure, refusing an unlawful command to save innocent lives. Naomi had listened to it over a dozen times, not because she doubted it, but because each playthrough anchored her more deeply in certainty. She looked up and said, "It's time." Dahlia leaned against the wall near the hallway, arms crossed. She didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. Her eyes met Naomi's, and there was no protest, no hesitation, just the silent agreement between two people who had already lived through the consequences. Naomi's fingers moved deliberately. She created a new account. Anonymous, no profile picture, no name. She titled the post, "What They Tried to Bury." In the description, she wrote, This is a real-time transmission from a mission the government won't acknowledge. A voice you've never heard did what others wouldn't. Listen, then decide what you believe. Then she hit upload. For a long moment, nothing happened. They waited. The internet in the house wasn't fast, but the file posted slowly, spreading through forums that tracked military history, whistleblower cases, and fringe podcast communities. Naomi didn't refresh the page. She stood, stretched, and said, "It's done. Now it's up to the world." Dahlia walked over and gave her a nod, one veteran to another. "No matter what happens now, we said it. That counts." The next day, an email arrived. It was from a podcast producer named Hank Laramie, a retired corporal who ran a small but respected show called The Barracks Report, where old soldiers told stories that didn't make it into official transcripts. The message was short. "Saw your file. Heard that voice. If she's willing to talk, I'll give her the airtime. Full respect. No edits." They sat around the laptop reading the message together. Greta was the first to speak. "You don't have to do it, Dahlia. Nobody's forcing you." Dahlia's hands were on the back of a dining chair, her fingers drumming lightly. "That's exactly why I'm going to." Carmen looked over. "You sure it'll make things real? Public?" Dahlia didn't blink. They made the lies real. It's time the truth caught up. They set up the call 2 days later. Hank's voice came through crisp and friendly, the kind of voice that had heard gunfire and didn't flinch. He asked simple questions. No tricks, no traps. Dahlia answered plainly, her tone even. She described the day of the mission, what she saw, what she heard, the decision she made. "There were children screaming," she said. "I could see their hands waving through the smoke. The call to pull out came in, but leaving would have meant letting them die. I was taught to protect civilians. That's what I did." And they called it insubordination. Hank's voice cracked slightly when he replied, "You did the right thing. Anyone with a soul can hear that." The episode aired the following evening. Within 12 hours, the comments began pouring in. Some were anonymous. Some were names that Dahlia hadn't seen in years. One read, "She pulled me out after I lost my leg. I was too out of it to say thank you then. I'm saying it now." Another, "I was in echo dust. I remember her. She stayed behind so the medevac could get us out. I don't care what the paperwork says. She saved lives." A woman named Riley posted, "My sister never came home from that mission. But I remember the letter she wrote before she mentioned a sergeant who risked everything to save kids. Now I know who that was." The podcast began trending on veteran message boards. People who had never met Dahlia were reposting the clip. Soldiers, medics, drone operators, retired commanders. Not a wave, but a ripple that spread with quiet, stubborn persistence. In the living room, Clara watched the interview on the tablet with Greta and Carmen beside her. The screen was small, but Dahlia's voice came through clearly. Clara leaned against Greta's shoulder and asked, "Do people believe her?" Now Greta nodded. "Some do, some don't. But some is more than none." Carmen added softly, "And once one person believes, it gets easier for the next." Later that evening, Dahlia stepped outside for air. The cold had returned a little, but the sky was clear stars visible even above the street lamps. Andrew followed her out, handing her a mug of tea. "You said it out loud," he said. Dahlia nodded, holding the mug close. "Didn't fix anything, but it felt better." Andrew looked at the street. "Funny how telling the truth still feels risky." She glanced at him. "Because it is." He didn't argue. Back inside, Naomi was tracking the post's traffic. It's been shared a couple thousand times. Nothing viral, but solid. It's sticking. Tasha looked over her shoulder. "That's all we need, something that holds." Juno was already pulling up old documents, redacted reports that might line up with Dahlia's account. If we line up enough truth, they'll stop being able to deny it. Greta looked up. "You really think that's how it works?" Juno didn't smile. "No, but I think that's how it starts." That night, they didn't make a big deal of it. They didn't celebrate. But they also didn't keep the lights dimmed or the curtains drawn. Devin played music through the old radio, something low and steady, not patriotic, not mournful, just present. Carmen cooked stew. Tasha lit a fire. Clara passed around bowls. They sat together as they had for weeks now, but something had changed. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were being seen. And even if the world never gave them medals or reinstated their records, they knew that somewhere someone was listening and believing. A week after the podcast aired, a letter arrived in a plain envelope stamped with the Pine County Family Court seal. It wasn't a surprise. They'd been waiting for it since the day Judith Saunders walked out the door, her parting words more promise than warning. Andrew read it twice before saying a word, then laid it flat on the table where everyone could see. "The county is opening a guardianship review hearing," he said. "They're questioning whether Clara should remain in my custody." The room went quiet, not from shock but from confirmation. Carmen folded her hands slowly. "So this is where they take her back, even though we did nothing wrong." Tasha leaned forward. "This is where we show up and make damn sure they can't." Andrew looked at Dahlia. "You don't have to speak. Any of you. I'll carry this." Dahlia shook her head firm but not angry. "You carried us the day you opened your door. Now we carry each other." On the morning of the hearing, the sun broke through the clouds in a weak but persistent beam, lighting up the courthouse steps like something half forgotten. The courtroom was small, windowless, fluorescent lit, the walls scuffed from years of quiet bureaucracy. The bailiff called the session to order with no ceremony. Judith was already there, her suit crisp, her hair tightly pinned. She nodded politely as Andrew and the others filed in, Clara holding Greta's hand. The judge, a middle-aged woman named Margaret Howley, spoke in a tone that tried to balance compassion with legal detachment. "We are here to evaluate the living conditions and custody of minor Clara Calloway. The court understands this is a sensitive matter and all parties will be heard." Judith rose. "Your Honor, the Department of Family Services received an anonymous report that the minor is residing in a home with non-related adults of undisclosed backgrounds, including individuals with prior military disciplinary records. While no harm has been documented, we are obligated to investigate concerns regarding stability, safety, and emotional well-being." She kept her voice soft, her words carefully framed as care, but each phrase landed like a stone in the room. Andrew stood next. "Clara is my daughter. Her mother died 5 years ago. I've raised her alone since. These women you're talking about, they didn't just show up. They helped fix my roof when it leaked. They made my daughter laugh again. They gave us back something we didn't even realize we'd lost." The judge asked if anyone else wished to speak. Juno stood first. Her hands were at her sides, her voice quiet but even. 2 weeks ago, Clara got sick. Fever chills, middle of the night. We didn't panic. We took shifts. I held her hand while Greta checked her temperature every hour. Carmen made soup. Dahlia called the nurse line because she remembered the triage protocol. We've been in harder emergencies. This one just mattered more. She stepped back. Carmen rose next. Her voice trembled once, then leveled out. "I lost my son 2 years ago. I couldn't hold him when he passed. He was with a foster family, and I wasn't stable enough, they said. Since I met Clara, I haven't taken sleeping pills. Not once. She asks about him sometimes, and I tell her the truth. And then she tells me she's glad I'm here. I don't want to be her mother, but I am part of what makes her safe." Greta walked forward with a worn piece of paper in her hand. "Clara and I wrote this together. It's a list of things worth staying for." She read a few pancakes with too much syrup, people who remember your name, fixing broken doors, holding someone's hand during a scary movie, being forgiven when you forget to take the trash out, knowing you belong even when the world forgets you. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. This child isn't confused. She knows who makes her feel like she matters. Devin spoke after. She stood beside the defense table, arms folded, then dropped them unclenched. "I had a hard time coming back. Memory gaps, noise in my head, nightmares. Clara talks to me like I'm just a person, not broken, not fragile. She asked me to help her build a fort out of blankets. It was the first time in 2 years I didn't feel like a liability. You can't put that in a report, but it's real." Then Dahlia walked up. She didn't speak from notes. Her stance was military, but her voice was human. "This courtroom doesn't know me. That's fine. Most of the world doesn't. But I stood between Clara and a frozen sidewalk when she slipped last week. I caught her. No one else saw it. I didn't need thanks. I just needed her to stay standing. If you want a definition of safe, start there." She stepped back. The judge looked toward Andrew. "Mr. Calloway, final statement." Andrew nodded and rose slowly. He looked tired, older than usual, but steady. "I didn't bring these women into our house to make a point. I didn't do it to be noble. I did it because when I saw them in the snow, I remembered what it felt like to not be seen. And because my daughter saw them too, not as threats, not as strangers, but as people." Clara laughs again. She sleeps through the night. She asks questions that don't come from fear. "If that's wrong, then I don't know how to be right anymore." He paused, then added, "If opening your door to people who've done hard things and survived harder means you lose the right to raise your own kid, then I guess you better write me up, because I'll do it again." The courtroom was silent. No gasps, no whispers. Just the stillness that follows when truth has filled every inch of a room and left no space for argument. The judge folded her hands, her face unreadable. This court will take the testimonies into consideration and issue a ruling within 48 hours. They walked out together, not triumphant, but intact. Clara squeezed Dahlia's hand. Dahlia looked down, eyes softening just slightly. "You okay, kiddo?" Clara nodded. "You didn't let them take me." Dahlia nodded once. Wasn't gonna happen. For the first time in a long while, the wind outside didn't bite so sharply. The courthouse was quieter than it had been during the hearing. There was no buzz of whispers, no shifting of feet or rustling of papers, just the subtle creak of the judge's chair as she re-entered and took her seat behind the worn oak bench. The group sat together in the front row, Andrew, Clara, Dahlia, Greta, Carmen, Devin, Juno, Naomi, and Tasha's shoulders tense but held high. Judith sat across the aisle, hands folded, expression unreadable. No one moved. Everyone waited. Judge Howley adjusted her glasses, her voice steady and without theatrics. After thorough review of the testimony documentation and living conditions, this court finds that the minor Clara Calloway is in a stable, emotionally supportive, and morally sound environment. The petition to reevaluate custody is denied. Guardianship will remain with Mr. Calloway with no further inquiries unless new evidence arises. No gasp filled the room. No outburst. Just breath, finally full and released. Clara looked at Andrew, then at Dahlia, then back to the judge. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came. She didn't need them. Andrew placed a hand gently on her back, grounding her. As the judge stood to leave someone in the second row, a man who had arrived quietly alone also stood. He was older than Andrew by at least 2 decades, hair a halo of white, his back slightly bowed from time but not defeat. He wore a faded olive coat with a fraying patch on the shoulder, a remnant of a war fought long before these women were born. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand in a formal military salute and aimed it straight at Dahlia. Dahlia, caught off guard, blinked once, then twice. She didn't move at first. She didn't return the salute. She simply looked at him, her mouth tightening slightly, not in refusal, but in control, in disbelief. The man held the salute steady for several seconds longer, then lowered his hand and gave her a small nod, one only a soldier would understand. No words, just acknowledgement. It was enough. From behind him, another person rose, then another. A woman with thick glasses and weathered skin, her cane set aside as she used the back of the bench for balance. A young man in civilian clothes but with the telltale ring of military bearing. One by one, without a word or cue, people stood, strangers who had sat through the hearing, quietly, silently judging with their presence. Now they made their judgment known without a sound. No applause, no shouting, just standing. Tasha leaned forward slightly as if unsure what was happening. Carmen's eyes welled, but she didn't speak. Greta sat back, hands in her lap, and smiled with the kind of peace that comes from something long denied, finally being given. Naomi gripped Devin's hand. Devin squeezed back. Juno stared ahead, her jaw tight, then whispered, "They see us." Outside, the morning had brightened. The sun wasn't warm yet, but the clouds had thinned, casting a soft, steady light across the sidewalk. When the group exited the building, the air was still crisp, but no longer biting. The silence of the courtroom carried with them, but it didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. As they walked, people began to approach, not many, not in crowds, but in 2s and 3s. A woman in a postal uniform stepped forward, handed Dahlia a folded note without a word, then left. A teenage boy with earbuds in and a Marine decal on his jacket gave Juno a nod, subtle but certain. An older black woman approached Greta, pressing a hand over her heart, then touching Greta's shoulder. No explanations, just presence. Back at the house, Clara ran to the living room and pulled a crumpled paper from her backpack. "We forgot the Stay Strong sign," she said, placing it carefully on the mantel. The women stood in the entryway for a moment, not entering fully, letting the quiet of the home settle around them. Then Andrew moved first, setting his keys down on the table, slipping off his jacket. "I made a promise," he said. "If this went well, I'd make cinnamon rolls." Greta raised a brow. "From scratch," he shrugged. "From a can. But I'll put love into it." Laughter came quiet but unforced. Carmen took the kettle to boil water. Juno opened the windows just a crack. Naomi flipped through the mail. It was all so ordinary it felt sacred. Later, Clara sat beside Devin at the table coloring. She didn't talk much, just hummed under her breath. Dahlia stood by the window, watching the sky shift from morning to noon. Andrew joined her, holding his coffee. He was Korean, I think he said. The guy who saluted you. Dahlia nodded. I figured. Funny, Andrew added. He didn't say a word. Dahlia finally turned to look at him. He didn't have to. Her voice was soft, measured, but firm. Words have never been what this country lacked. What we've lacked is someone willing to just stand up. That afternoon, the girls didn't talk about the hearing. They baked. They cleaned. Naomi helped Clara with a school project. Devin fixed the heater's rattling vent. Carmen sorted through old photographs and began pinning them to a board. A photo of them shoveling snow together. One of Greta and Clara baking. One of Tasha asleep on the couch with the dog. A wall of proof, not for anyone else, but for them. Later that night, Dahlia wrote a single sentence in a notebook she hadn't touched since being discharged. It read, "Today someone stood up." She didn't need to write more. The house was still. The snow outside had stopped. And for the first time in a long while, the future felt like something that could be entered, not endured. 3 weeks after the hearing, the letter arrived not from the court this time, but from Washington, D.C., stamped with the seal of the National Veterans Council. Dahlia opened it slowly, her hand steady, but her breath held as if bracing for another form of rejection. But this time, the envelope did not contain a summons or a denial. It was an invitation. The council was hosting its annual memorial for service members erased by circumstance, bureaucratic failures, or silence. And they were asking her by name to speak. The letter read in part, "We failed to record your service. We now correct the record." It was a sentence that made her sit down on the edge of the couch, eyes scanning it again and again, not for doubt, but because she needed to believe it had actually been written. Andrew stood across the room, having just come back from picking up groceries. He saw the paper in her hand, saw the way her mouth moved, but didn't form words. "Something bad?" he asked. Dahlia shook her head once slowly. "Something good, I think." Clara peeked over Greta's shoulder, then ran to hug Dahlia without asking what it was about. She didn't need to know. She just felt it. The weeks that followed were full, not of noise, but of motion, slow and forward. Tasha received a call from the State Guard's Women's Defense Division. One of the few senior advisors who'd heard the podcast clip wanted to bring her on as a training consultant for young female recruits. Tasha hesitated. "They buried me once," she said over dinner. Greta responded, "Then make sure they remember you while you're standing." Tasha said yes. Carmen launched her blog. It was simple at first, just a few posts about grief, loneliness, and trying to find your name again when the world forgot it. Then a comment came. Then an email. Then a dozen. Mothers from different states, different languages, different wars. Some had lost children. Some had been labeled unstable. All had something to say. Carmen began answering each one personally, sometimes typing late into the night with her coffee gone cold. She told Andrew, "I didn't know helping others would make me feel less empty, but it does." Naomi began working with a local library's military history wing. She proposed a side archive, one for cases never finished, names erased from active duty records. She called it Those Who Were Removed. It wasn't about proving anyone right. It was about keeping memory safe. The library board approved it unanimously. One morning, she sat with Clara on the floor, helping her glue photos onto a poster for school. Clara asked, "Why do names matter so much?" Naomi looked at her and said, "Because names mean we were here, even when no one was looking." Greta started volunteering at a grief support program for children who had lost parents in service. It was quiet work, drawing with crayons, sitting in circles, baking cookies that didn't always rise right. But the kids began to open up, and she knew how to listen. She brought home stories, some of them too heavy to say aloud, but always worth holding. She told Dahlia once, "I'm not doing this to fix them. I'm doing this because no one fixed me, and I still found my way. I want them to see that's possible." Devin began teaching intro robotics and coding at the local youth center with a special focus on LGBTQ+ teens. She built a course from scratch using what she could remember, piecing together blueprints from a brain that still had dark patches, but also bright ones. One day, a student stayed late and said, "You don't act like a teacher." Devin smiled, a little unsure. "That bad?" The kids shook their head. "No, it's like you're not pretending." It stuck with her all night. When the day of the memorial came, the women rode together to the state capitol. They wore what they had, no uniforms, no medals, but stood in line as invited guests, not ghosts. Dahlia was last to speak. The hall was simple wooden walls, fold-out chairs, and a podium that looked borrowed, but the audience was still. Veteran students, historians, people who had spent their lives recording names now looked up to hear one spoken for the first time. Dahlia stepped forward. Her speech was short. We weren't supposed to come back. Not just from war, but from being erased. But we did. And I'm not here because I made more noise. I'm here because someone opened their door. Because a child asked my name. Because people stood when it mattered. She looked out at the rows of faces. We all want to be remembered for something. Let this be enough that we kept going, even when no one kept track. The applause wasn't thunderous, but it was full. Not just for her, but for all of them. Afterward, a retired general approached. He didn't say much, just shook her hand and said, "It's overdue." She nodded. "It usually is." That evening, back in Everpine, the group sat on the porch, the air warm enough to leave the door open. Clara ran in and out with a flashlight looking for frogs in the tall grass. No one spoke of speeches or applause. They just sat, together, seen. The next morning, a small package arrived in the mail. Inside was a framed certificate from the Veterans Council. It bore no rank, no title, just a single line, "Service recognized." Dahlia placed it on the shelf by the window next to a potted plant Clara had been nursing back to life. She didn't mention it again. She didn't need to. It was enough. And for the first time since her discharge, she didn't feel like she was still trying to come home. She was already there. It was a Saturday morning, weeks after the memorial, and the first thaw of spring had finally arrived. The snow had pulled back from the hills like a curtain being drawn, revealing patches of brown grass struggling to find green. Birds had returned to the branches, cautious but persistent, like they were testing if the world was ready again. Inside the house, the women moved slowly, not from fatigue, but from the comfort of routine, each one aware that normalcy, no matter how quiet, was something hard-earned. Clara stood at the back door in her boots and jacket, her cheeks flushed from the morning air. "Can everyone come out? I have something to show you," she said, her voice bright and certain. They followed her one by one up the small hill behind the house. The path was muddy and uneven, but familiar. Andrew came last, holding 2 folded lawn chairs and a thermos of coffee. At the top of the hill, just past the oak tree that had lost half its branches in the winter storm, Clara pointed to a wooden sign stuck firmly into the earth. It was no more than a foot wide, hand-painted slightly crooked, but the words were clear, painted in careful block letters. This hill was held by 6 who were told to leave. No one said anything at first. Devin stepped closer, kneeling to adjust the base, so it wouldn't tip. Tasha ran her hand over the edge, checking the paint. Carmen stood back, arms crossed tightly, like the words were something she'd waited to see her whole life. Greta touched the back of Clara's shoulder gently. "Did you do this alone?" Clara shook her head. Maya helped. She said every town should have a place like this. Andrew set the chairs down and poured coffee into metal cups. "We can add more names," he said, "if you want. Maybe one day it won't just be this hill." Dahlia didn't answer right away. She stood at the edge looking out across the town, her eyes steady. Then she said, "This is enough. We stayed. That's the story." They sat there for a long time, not speaking much. Just the sound of cups being refilled, birds overhead, Clara laughing with Maya down the hill. Naomi scribbled something into her notebook. Juno closed her eyes for a few minutes and opened them again when the wind shifted. There was no ceremony, just people being together. Later, back inside, the day unfolded like any other. Devin helped fix the hinges on a cabinet door. Greta baked bread that rose too high and overflowed slightly. Carmen read an email from a woman in New Mexico who had lost her daughter in a training accident and was asking for advice on how to keep going. Tasha gave a lecture via Zoom to a group of new recruits who had no idea what kind of strength was sitting in front of them. Dahlia sat with Andrew on the porch as evening came. The sky turned that odd shade of blue-gray, and the stars began to emerge, not all at once, but as if deciding whether it was safe to be seen. The porch light buzzed softly, casting a warm glow across the old wood floorboards. Andrew leaned back in his chair. "You know, I used to think I didn't do anything that mattered. I went to work. I fixed things. I tried to keep Clara safe. I didn't think that was enough." Dahlia took a sip from her mug. "It is." He looked over at her, serious. "If you hadn't shown up that night, I might still be stuck thinking I was just surviving." She met his gaze. "If you hadn't stopped, we might not have survived at all." The porch fell quiet. Not the awkward kind, The kind that comes from knowing there's nothing more to prove. The kind that comes when you've said the most important parts and trust they've been heard. Inside, Clara curled up next to Naomi, who was reading aloud from a book about coral reefs. Greta sat nearby sewing a button onto one of Carmen's jackets. Tasha stood at the window, her posture relaxed for once. Devin was assembling a puzzle with Maya pieces slowly forming a picture of a lighthouse. They didn't talk about the war. Not often. They didn't need to. Their days now were made of smaller battles, healing knees, restarting dreams, remembering how to rest. But every now and then someone would reach for a tool, or fold a blanket, or adjust a loose drawer, and it would mean more than it seemed. These weren't the grand acts they had once trained for. They weren't saving lives in deserts, or decoding intercepted messages. But they were showing up. They were staying. And that in this house, in this town, meant something. That night, Dahlia wrote again in her notebook. This time, she didn't use a sentence. She just listed names, hers, Devin's, Carmen's, Juno's, Greta's, Tasha's, and underneath she wrote, "Still here." When the lights went out and the last door clicked shut, the house didn't feel like a shelter anymore. It felt like a home, and the people inside weren't lost or waiting for permission to matter. They belonged, without needing to explain why, without needing to leave again. And as the stars settled into place above them, one by one, no louder than a breath, they stayed. Together. Thank you, truly, for staying with us all the way to the end of this story. It wasn't short, it wasn't easy, but maybe that's what makes it matter. You gave your time, your heart, and your attention to voices that so often go unheard. That means more than words can say. Some stories don't end in grand victories. Sometimes they end in quiet strength, in people choosing to stay, in names once forgotten, finally spoken out loud. And if this story moved you even just a little, I want to invite you to take a breath with us. Sit with what you felt. Share your thoughts. Let your voice join theirs. Tell us, where are you listening from? What did this story make you feel? Whether you're here for the first time or you've been walking with us for a while, your presence is felt. Your support helps us keep telling stories that carry weight, stories that ask us not just to look, but to care. And if you'd like to see more like this, please consider giving a like, subscribing, and staying with us as we continue. We're deeply grateful to have you here. Until next time, stay human, stay kind, and above all, stay.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.